By the following Monday, the house had already started changing in small, calculated ways. A different shampoo bottle appeared in the upstairs shower. New groceries filled the refrigerator shelves Claire used to organize by habit every Sunday night. Expensive organic fruit, imported sparkling water, almond milk Richard never drank himself. The mistress had started behaving like someone settling into a long-term address instead of a temporary scandal. But the real shift wasn't emotional. It was financial. Claire noticed charges moving through accounts Richard assumed she never reviewed. Additional grocery deliveries. Increased utility usage. A second garage opener activated through the property system. Extra meals billed through the household Amex account. Tiny details most people ignore because they seem domestic. Claire treated them like data points. Every household tells the truth through cash flow long before people do. That was something her father taught her years before she ever met Richard Mercer. In wealthy American households, appearances are often misleading. The man driving the Mercedes usually looks powerful. The woman quietly reviewing insurance renewals at the kitchen counter rarely does. But property taxes don't care about confidence. Mortgage structures don't care who speaks louder at dinner. Insurance liability doesn't care who cheats better. Numbers only follow names, signatures, and responsibility. Claire understood that world better than anyone around her realized. Every Tuesday morning, she drove 20 minutes into downtown Stamford wearing plain office slacks and carrying the same dark leather tote she'd owned for years. Nobody at the local bank branch would have guessed the woman standing quietly near the commercial accounts desk controlled multiple holding entities connected to real estate assets worth over $20 million. Claire liked it that way. Wealth hidden inside paperwork survives longer than wealth displayed through lifestyle. Richard never fully understood that principle because Richard believed visible money created authority. Big dinners, political donations, investment panels in Manhattan. He lived in the world of perception. Claire lived in the world beneath it. The world where escrow accounts, title insurance, wire receipts, and LLC registrations quietly determined who actually controlled the future. 3 days after moving his mistress into the estate, Richard made another mistake. He called the family office accountant and instructed him to freeze one of Claire's discretionary spending accounts. It wasn't a massive account by Mercer standards. Around $12,000 monthly for personal expenses, groceries, fuel, and household incidentals. To Richard, it was symbolic. A reminder of dependency. A message. But when the accountant hesitated on speakerphone and quietly explained the account technically originated from Claire's trust distribution structure, the room went silent for 2 full seconds. Richard brushed it off immediately, irritated more than concerned. Then reroute it, he said coldly. Figure it out. Claire sat 20 feet away at the breakfast table reviewing a homeowner's insurance renewal packet as if she hadn't heard any of it. But she noticed something important in Richard's voice for the first time that week. Uncertainty. Tiny. Controlled. But real. Because beneath the image of a billionaire who financed luxury vacations and private club memberships, Richard Mercer had never paid attention to the architecture holding his own lifestyle together. He paid invoices. Claire built systems. He covered monthly burn. Claire understood ownership layers. The mansion itself still carried a modest mortgage balance despite Richard being worth hundreds of millions. Not because they needed financing, but because Claire had structured the property intentionally through tax strategy and liability shielding years earlier. Separate entities. Separate obligations. Separate exposure. Richard signed documents without reading most of them carefully because he trusted status more than structure. That trust was about to become very expensive. Later that afternoon, Claire stopped outside a small law office near Bedford Street. No dramatic entrance. No emotional breakdown. She simply handed the receptionist a storage envelope containing copies of utility records, banking, statements, occupancy logs, and one printed screenshot from the estate's internal security system. At the very bottom sat a single missing item she had finally recovered that morning from Richard's study drawer. The original county-certified property deed with only one legal owner listed. Most people watching Richard and Claire Mercer would have made the exact same mistake Richard made. They would have assumed the man wearing the tailored suit owned everything around him. The house, the accounts, the power, the future. And they would have assumed the quiet younger woman organizing paperwork at the dining table was simply benefiting from his success. That assumption exists in almost every wealthy neighborhood in America. We confuse visible spending with ownership because visible spending is easier to recognize. The car in the driveway looks like power. The private club membership looks like power. The black Amex card hitting the restaurant table looks like power. But real ownership rarely announces itself. It hides inside filing cabinets, trust structures, tax records, and signatures people never bother reading carefully. Richard Mercer understood how to look rich. Claire understood how to stay protected. Those are not the same skill. Every month, Richard covered massive expenses without hesitation. The estate staff payroll, the car leases, insurance premiums, property maintenance, five-figure wine purchases, weekend flights to Aspen. To outsiders, that made him the unquestioned authority inside the marriage. Even the mistress started treating Claire like someone slowly being replaced instead of someone who legally controlled the foundation beneath everyone's feet. That's how financial illusions work. People start believing the person funding the lifestyle must automatically own the lifestyle. But paying monthly bills does not necessarily create ownership. Sometimes it simply creates expenses. There's a major difference between financing a life and controlling the structure underneath it. A person can make $2 million a year and still own almost nothing personally if every asset, every property, every business entity, and every account is legally tied somewhere else. Another person can appear ordinary while quietly controlling the actual infrastructure holding everything together. Richard spent money loudly. Claire organized money silently. One created appearance. The other created permanence. And most people are trained to admire appearance first. Think about how often society confuses income with wealth. Someone earning a high salary gets treated like they're financially secure even if they're drowning in debt, leases, and liabilities. Meanwhile, the quiet person driving a 5-year-old SUV while holding title ownership in multiple appreciating properties gets ignored because they don't look impressive enough. Looking rich and owning assets are completely different games. Richard never learned that distinction emotionally because money had always worked in his favor. He walked into rooms and people moved aside. Bankers returned calls immediately. Restaurant reservations appeared instantly. Over time, that kind of treatment creates a dangerous belief. If people obey you socially, you must also control reality legally. But the law doesn't operate on ego. Courts don't care who spoke louder at dinner. County records don't care who embarrassed who publicly. Ownership is determined by documents, not dominance. That was the belief quietly collapsing underneath Richard's entire world without him realizing it yet. Claire understood another truth most people ignore. Emotional reactions rarely win financial conflicts. Evidence does. Richard raised his voice. Claire copied statements. The mistress mocked her clothes. Claire reviewed occupancy laws. Richard tried controlling access to money. Claire traced account origins and ownership chains. Loud accusations feel powerful in the moment because they attract attention. Quiet documents become powerful later because they survive scrutiny. And maybe that's the uncomfortable question underneath this entire story. If someone suddenly challenged your financial security tomorrow, what would actually protect you? Your income? Your confidence? Your social image? Or the paperwork tied to your name? Because Richard Mercer was about to discover something most people never think about until it's too late. The person controlling the monthly payments is not always the person controlling the asset. And hidden deep inside Claire's legal structure was a financial mechanism Richard had ignored for years, one capable of turning his entire version of reality against him. Richard Mercer spent most of his adult life believing money solved problems because, for men like him, it usually did. If a company struggled, he injected capital. If a deal stalled, he increased pressure. If someone resisted him, he outspent them. That strategy worked perfectly in boardrooms because most business conflicts revolve around negotiation. But personal finance inside a marriage follows a different set of rules. In private life, the person spending the most money is not automatically the person protected the best. And that was the mechanism quietly forming underneath Richard's feet for years without him fully noticing it. Claire understood something simple that many people overlook because nobody teaches it clearly enough. Assets are supposed to protect you or eventually put money back into your life. Liabilities quietly pull money away from you month after month while pretending to look impressive. The Mercer estate looked like a symbol of wealth, but legally, It functioned like a shield because Claire structured it correctly from the beginning. The property title sat under a holding company connected to her trust. The insurance policies listed specific liability protections. The payment records established where the original acquisition funds came from. The paperwork created separation between appearance and ownership. Richard focused on lifestyle. Claire focused on structure. That difference changes everything when relationships collapse. Think about how most people handle money emotionally. They assume whoever pays the mortgage owns the house. Whoever pays the car note owns the car. Whoever covers dinner controls the relationship. But monthly payments are often just maintenance costs. Real ownership depends on documentation. A lease payment doesn't equal equity. A luxury lifestyle doesn't equal protection. And emotional confidence definitely doesn't override. County records. Claire understood cash flow the same way a good business owner understands employees. Money moves every month whether people pay attention or not. Insurance premiums leave accounts automatically. Property taxes arrive every quarter. Utilities draft silently. Credit card interest accumulates quietly. Cash flow never sleeps. It behaves like invisible workers constantly carrying money either toward your future or away from it. Most people only notice money when there's a crisis. Claire noticed patterns before crises happened. That's why she kept records for everything. Copies of escrow transfers, property tax filings, insurance renewals, wire confirmations, maintenance invoices, security logs from the estate cameras. She wasn't paranoid. She was organized. There's a difference. Paperwork feels boring when life is stable. But paperwork becomes power the moment conflict begins. That's because evidence forces emotions to become quiet. Richard could accuse Claire of overreacting. The mistress could mock her silence. Friends could gossip. None of that mattered once records entered the conversation. A bank statement doesn't care about public opinion. A deed doesn't care who sounded more confident at dinner. Camera footage doesn't adjust itself to protect someone's ego. Documents freeze reality permanently in ways emotions never can. Years earlier, after rumors of Richard's first affair circulated through Manhattan social circles, Claire made one decision that would eventually save her entire financial position. She updated the prenuptial agreement alongside a property liability review recommended by an attorney specializing in family asset protection. Richard barely skimmed the revisions before signing. To him, legal paperwork was administrative clutter handled by assistants and lawyers. To Claire, it was armor. Quiet armor. The kind nobody notices until they try to take something from you. That armor now existed across dozens of places Richard had ignored for years. Bank archives, county records, insurance databases, digital timestamps, security servers hidden behind locked administrative panels inside the estate office. And somewhere inside the recovered leather folder sitting now in Claire's attorney's office was one particular document Richard had never bothered reading carefully, a single page capable of collapsing every assumption he still believed about who truly controlled the Mercer estate. The first person who realized Claire Mercer had been preparing long before the affair became public was not Richard. It was Richard's attorney. 2 days after the confrontation in the kitchen, Claire arrived quietly at a law office on Atlantic Street, carrying the same dark leather folder she had recovered from Richard's study. No dramatic expression, no visible anger. Just a calm woman in a gray wool coat sitting across from a polished conference table while Manhattan rain slid slowly down the windows behind her. She placed the folder down carefully, unzipped it halfway, and slid out a single bank statement. One line had been circled neatly in red ink. A wire transfer dated 7 years earlier. $2,800,000 sent from the Whitmore family trust into the escrow account used to purchase the Mercer estate. Underneath it sat the original county-certified deed. One legal owner. Claire Whitmore Mercer Holdings, LLC. Richard's attorney stared at the page longer than expected. That was the moment everything shifted for him internally, even if nobody else understood it yet. Experienced lawyers recognize preparation immediately. Sloppy people bring emotions into legal offices. Prepared people bring timelines, records, and indexed evidence. Claire had tabs separating insurance filings, payment records, tax receipts, maintenance invoices, and digital printouts from the estate's security system. One screenshot showed Richard entering the private office cabinet the morning the folder disappeared. Another showed the mistress using electronic key access to rooms Claire had specifically restricted months earlier. Tiny details. But details become patterns. Patterns become narratives. Narratives become leverage. Claire never once raised her voice during the meeting. She simply answered questions. Who funded the acquisition? Which entity carried title ownership? Who maintained liability coverage? Which accounts paid property taxes? Everything connected cleanly. Organized. Quiet. Difficult to attack. Meanwhile, across town, Richard still believed the conflict was emotional. Temporary. Manageable. He assumed Claire would either break down or negotiate privately to avoid embarrassment. That assumption came from years of social success. Men like Richard often believe confidence itself is a form of legal protection because most people around them eventually submit to pressure. But pressure works differently when someone has documentation. Richard's attorney understood that before Richard did. By the end of the meeting, the older man leaned back slowly in his chair and removed his glasses. He had spent 30 years protecting executives, investors, and wealthy families during ugly divorces and asset disputes. And he recognized something dangerous inside Claire immediately. Discipline, not revenge. Discipline scares experienced professionals more because disciplined people think long-term. You kept all of this? He asked quietly. Claire nodded once. Every payment, she said. Every transfer. Every modification. Then she reached into the folder again and placed a second document on the table. A post-nuptial amendment signed 3 years earlier after Richard's first public scandal. Richard had signed it during a private settlement weekend in Napa, barely reading the updated clauses buried between liability provisions and trust protections. The attorney's expression changed again. Because now this wasn't just about a house. This was about structure. Multiple layers of structure. Outside the office walls, nobody saw any of this. Richard's friends still viewed Claire as the younger wife who got lucky marrying wealth. The mistress still treated her like an obstacle waiting to disappear. Even the estate staff moved nervously around Richard instead of Claire because people naturally fear visible authority more than silent preparation. That's the irony about financial power. Real financial power rarely looks dramatic while it's building. It looks boring, repetitive, organized. Quiet people saving emails. Quiet people storing records. Quiet people reviewing signatures while louder people underestimate them. Because people who truly understand money know something emotional people often forget. Systems outlast arguments. And somewhere inside the remaining documents still sealed inside Claire's leather folder sat one final piece of evidence capable of turning not only Richard's private life upside down, but also his public reputation once lawyers, family members, and social circles inevitably became involved. The pressure campaign against Claire started quietly, then spread through social circles exactly the way financial shame usually spreads in wealthy communities, through whispers disguised as concern. By the end of the week, Richard's sister was calling relatives saying Claire had become emotionally unstable. His mother told friends at the country club that Claire was trying to punish Richard financially. The mistress began leaving subtle traces of herself throughout the estate, as if marking territory publicly mattered more than legal ownership privately. New flowers appeared in the entryway. Different wine selections filled the dining room. Small acts designed to communicate replacement. And because most people instinctively trust confidence over silence, the social narrative immediately tilted against Claire. That's another financial trap many people fall into without realizing it. Society rewards appearances first and checks facts later. The person speaking calmly in a cashmere coat usually gets believed before the quiet person holding documents. Richard understood that dynamic extremely well. He built entire business deals around perception. In public, he framed himself as the exhausted provider dealing with an irrational younger wife who suddenly wanted control after years of luxury. It sounded believable because the lifestyle was visible. The house, the vacations, the staff, the cars. People saw the spending and assumed they understood the ownership behind it. Few people ever stop to ask who actually holds title to the life being displayed. Claire noticed something else during those days. Nobody criticized Richard for moving another woman into the estate. Instead, they criticized her for potentially disrupting the image of stability around him. That revealed the deeper truth underneath many financial relationships in America. People often spend enormous amounts of money not to improve their lives, but to protect appearances. Families keep oversized homes they cannot comfortably afford because downsizing looks like failure. Couples stay buried in debt to maintain a lifestyle neighbors recognize. Professionals lease luxury cars to signal status while silently sacrificing long-term security. Even marriages sometimes survive on image long after trust disappears because social acceptance feels financially safer than starting over. Richard counted on that fear. He assumed Claire would preserve the illusion to avoid public humiliation. And for a while, the strategy seemed to work. Mutual friends stopped calling her directly. Invitations disappeared. One afternoon at the estate, Richard's mother looked around the kitchen and said coldly, "Do you really want to destroy everything over paperwork?" Claire almost smiled when she heard that word. Paperwork. As if paperwork were some technical inconvenience standing in the way of emotion. But paperwork is exactly what separates ownership from fantasy. Rich people understand this better than anyone. That's why billionaires hire attorneys before problems begin, not after. That's why corporations document everything. That's why banks require signatures for every serious transaction. Emotion creates noise. Documentation creates consequences. Claire never defended herself emotionally, because emotional defense usually traps people into reacting publicly before they are strategically prepared privately. Instead, she kept organizing records, additional security logs, utility histories, financial transfers, access records from the estate's internal systems. Every quiet action made Richard more confident because he mistook silence for surrender. The mistress made the same mistake. One evening during a dinner party attended by two of Richard's investors, she casually referred to the estate as our home, while laughing over wine beside the fireplace. Nobody corrected her. Claire simply watched from across the room, while one investor's wife studied her expression carefully. Older money recognizes controlled silence differently than new money does. Truly wealthy people know calm behavior during conflict usually means someone already understands their position. Later that night, after the guests left, Richard received a call from his attorney that lasted less than 4 minutes. When he walked back inside, his expression had changed for the first time since the affair became public. Not panic, not yet, but calculation. Because somewhere between the legal filings, trust structures, and ownership records, Richard was beginning to realize Claire had chosen a strategy completely opposite from what most people choose under pressure. While everyone else focused on protecting appearances, she had been protecting leverage. The room became quiet long before anyone actually understood they had lost. It happened inside a private conference room overlooking downtown Stanford, the kind designed for wealthy people who prefer legal problems handled behind closed doors. Dark walnut table. Bottled water nobody touched. Floor-to-ceiling windows reflecting gray afternoon light across polished stone floors. Richard sat near the head of the table beside his attorney, still carrying the composed posture that had controlled boardrooms for decades. The mistress sat farther down, unusually silent for once. Claire arrived alone except for the leather folder resting calmly beside her chair. No dramatic entrance. No visible anger. That was what unsettled people the most. Calmness during financial conflict usually means someone already knows where the numbers lead. Richard's attorney opened first, carefully outlining possible settlement conversations, occupancy arrangements, temporary property usage, professional language, controlled language. But underneath it sat one assumption Richard still hadn't fully abandoned, that the estate somehow belonged to him in every way that mattered. Then Claire's attorney reached forward and unzipped the leather folder completely for the first time. The sound itself seemed louder than expected in the room. One document slid onto the table. County certified property deed. Original seal visible in blue ink. Legal ownership. Registered solely under Claire Whitmore Mercer Holdings, LLC. Richard's name appeared nowhere. Not as owner. Not as co-owner. Not even as beneficiary. Silence. Nobody interrupted because paperwork removes the need for interruption. Claire's attorney placed down a second document. Escrow transfer confirmation. $2.8 million wired directly from the Whitmore Family Trust into the purchase account 7 years earlier. Then came the bank statements, property tax records, insurance payment histories, utility account structures. Every major financial obligation tied either to Claire personally or to holding entities under her control. Richard had paid many monthly expenses over the years, but those payments functioned more like operating costs than ownership claims. The legal structure beneath the estate never belonged to him. Not once. The mistress looked confused first. She had spent weeks walking through rooms, believing proximity created entitlement. But luxury often creates illusions. Living inside wealth does not automatically mean owning it. Claire remained perfectly still while her attorney continued. Security access logs showed restricted administrative areas entered without authorization. Camera timestamps confirmed who removed the folder from Richard's study cabinet days earlier. Even the household staffing invoices revealed Claire's LLC paid operational salaries directly. Piece by piece, every assumption Richard relied on collapsed quietly under documentation. No screaming. No insults. Just records. That's the uncomfortable thing about evidence. Once it appears, emotion loses value immediately. Richard leaned back slowly in his chair, staring at the deed longer than anyone else in the room. For the first time since the affair began, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a man realizing he had mistaken lifestyle access for legal authority. His attorney finally broke the silence carefully. "Richard," he said quietly, "paying for a life and owning a life are not the same thing." The sentence landed harder than any accusation could have, because it exposed the real issue underneath everything. Richard spent years believing income created permanent control. But wealth built on appearances can disappear the moment paperwork enters the conversation. Claire understood something he ignored. Ownership is not determined by who talks louder at dinner parties or who pays for vacations. Ownership is determined by names attached to assets, signatures attached to contracts, and records attached to cash flow. That's why truly wealthy people protect documents more carefully than jewelry. Jewelry impresses strangers. Documents survive courtrooms. Claire's attorney finally slid one final paper across the table, the postnuptial amendment Richard signed years earlier, without properly reviewing. A single highlighted clause confirmed occupancy rights, asset separation, and legal authority over the estate structure during marital disputes. Richard stared at his own signature beneath the clause for several long seconds. Nobody in the room spoke after that, because there was nothing left to debate. The evidence had already chosen the winner. But what happened next would matter even more than the documents themselves, because once legal ownership became undeniable, the consequences would move beyond private humiliation and begin affecting reputation, access, and the financial future Richard thought he still controlled. The outcome did not arrive in a dramatic explosion of conflict. It arrived the way most financial consequences actually arrive in real life, through confirmation, compliance, and quiet enforcement of documentation that already existed long before anyone decided to argue about it. Within 48 hours of the conference room meeting, Richard Mercer's legal team received formal verification from Claire's attorney and the county records office. The Mercer estate was registered under Claire Whitmore Mercer Holdings LLC, and no competing claim had ever been recorded. That single fact shaped everything that followed. There was no taking of the house. There was only recognition of ownership that had already been established years earlier. The locksmith arrived the next morning, not with aggression or urgency, but with paperwork confirming authorization from the legal owner of record. The locks were changed according to standard property protection protocol, a process that happens thousands of times a day across American real estate when ownership rights are clarified or occupancy rights are restructured. Richard did not lose access because of emotion or conflict. He lost access because access follows title, and title follows documentation. Inside the banking system, nothing emotional occurred either. Claire's financial advisor requested a formal audit of shared operational accounts tied to the estate. The bank complied, as banks always do when presented with proper legal authority and court-aligned documentation. Payment histories were reviewed. Transaction origins were confirmed. Expense flows were mapped to their originating entities. Nothing was hidden, because nothing needed to be hidden. The structure had always been transparent on paper. It was only misunderstood in perception. Meanwhile, the insurance provider updated liability records to reflect the correct ownership structure. The mortgage servicer confirmed the remaining balance and its responsible entity. Every institution involved followed the same principle. Money moves through systems, and systems move through names. Richard's influence in private equity meant nothing in these processes. Wealth does not override registry. Reputation does not override filings. Control does not override contracts. Claire did not celebrate any of it. She simply continued doing what she had always done, reviewing documents, confirming structure, and maintaining financial clarity. Even Richard's attorney eventually acknowledged the reality without resistance. "Everything here is legally consistent," he said during a final review meeting. Not as a victory statement, as a factual conclusion. The case did not collapse. It resolved itself through alignment between records and reality. The mistress quietly exited the situation not through confrontation, but through absence of legal standing. There was no need for escalation because there was no claim supported by documentation. In the end, the only thing the system recognized was what had always been written down. For anyone watching from the outside, the lesson was not about revenge or reversal. It was about structure. Claire's position had never depended on emotional strength. It depended on financial architecture built long before conflict ever appeared. And that is where the quiet checklist behind everything becomes unavoidable for anyone paying attention. Who is actually named on the title of your most important assets? Where does your monthly cash flow truly originate? And where does it actually go? Are your bank statements aligned with ownership or just lifestyle? Do you hold copies of the documents that define your financial reality? Or are you relying on assumptions built from spending patterns? Are you protecting assets through structure or trying to defend them through emotion? And perhaps most importantly, are you paying for stability or accidentally paying for appearances that feel like stability? In situations like this, emotion feels immediate, but documentation decides outcomes. That is why wealthy people who understand money rarely argue loudly about ownership. They already built systems that speak for them. And as Richard Mercer slowly began to understand the full extent of what had happened, the final realization was not about losing a house or a relationship. It was about something far more fundamental. How little control exists when you misunderstand the difference between spending money and owning structure. What came next would not be about recovery, but about identity itself, and the kind of financial truth most people only learn when it is already too late. In the end, nothing about Richard Mercer's world collapsed loudly. There was no cinematic breakdown, no dramatic confrontation that rewrote reality in a single moment. What happened instead was far more ordinary and far more absolute. The systems that had always governed ownership simply continued doing what they were designed to do. Titles determined rights. Contracts determined control. Records determined truth. And emotion, no matter how intense, was never part of the equation. Richard Mercer sat in silence in the weeks that followed, not because he was defeated in a personal sense, but because he was forced into a realization that cannot be argued with. He had mistaken influence for ownership. For years, he moved through life believing that financial contribution equaled authority. That paying for the lifestyle meant he controlled the structure. That visibility meant power. But structure had never belonged to him. It had always belonged to documentation he never fully understood. Claire Mercer, by contrast, did not change in any visible way. She did not become louder. She did not become harsher. She did not attempt to turn the situation into a story of revenge. Instead, she remained exactly what she had always been: methodical, quiet, and precise in how she interacted with money. The difference now was not personality. It was awareness. She understood that wealth is not defined by how much money moves through your life, but by what remains protected when conflict appears. That understanding is what separated survival from exposure. Richard, the quiet billionaire who had built his empire through private equity and understated control, had always understood one part of money deeply: how to generate it, move it, and multiply it in business environments. But he had underestimated the second half of financial intelligence: how ownership is preserved through structure, legal clarity, and restraint in emotional decision-making. Claire, younger and often underestimated, had learned the opposite lesson early. She understood that money becomes dangerous when it is emotionally reactive, that assets can be lost not through lack of income, but through lack of documentation discipline, and that the most expensive mistakes are rarely made in markets. They are made in relationships where people assume trust replaces structure. What happened between them was not a victory of one person over another. It was the exposure of two different financial identities. One built on visible control. One built on invisible protection. One relied on being seen as powerful. The other relied on being legally unshakable. Over time, the truth of their situation became less about the estate, less about the relationship, and more about a fundamental financial reality most people never fully internalize. You are not protected by what you earn, but by what you can prove you own. You are not secured by how much you spend, but by how clearly your assets are structured. And you are not stable because of how confident you feel, but because of how resilient your documentation remains when confidence disappears. Richard Mercer's final realization was not emotional, it was structural. He had operated in a world where success was measured by leverage, negotiation, and presence. But ownership lives in a different world entirely. It lives in filings, signatures, and systems that do not care who feels in control. Claire's lesson was quieter, but more enduring. She learned that financial safety is not built in moments of crisis. It is built long before crisis ever arrives, in decisions nobody sees, in documents nobody reads, and in habits that prioritize clarity over comfort. In the end, the difference between them was not wealth. It was understanding. One understood how money looks. The other understood how money is protected. And that is the identity shift that defines everything underneath the surface of this story. People who understand money do not rely on noise to validate their position. They rely on ownership, cash flow awareness, legal structure, disciplined documentation, and the ability to remain calm when others lose control. Richard Mercer learned too late that influence without structure is temporary. Claire Mercer proved that silence combined with preparation is often irreversible. And the final truth that remains is simple. Do not try to look powerful in a world where paperwork decides reality. Build a life where truth, assets, and evidence quietly protect you long before you ever need to defend them.